Welcome. My name is Devorah Stern, LCSW, and this is the Fulfillment Power Summit. We are assisting people in clearing limiting beliefs to obtain optimal mental, physical, and spiritual health to live the life of your dreams. And here I am so proud to present to you Dr. David Berceli. I had the honor of studying under him in California at the Esalen Institute and in Phoenix. I'm very fortunate to become a TRE practitioner level 1. And I'm going to have Dr. David Berceli explain this whole movement to you. He is the founder. He came up with this. A lot of it is based on Dr. Stephen Porges's basal vagal theory, and I think David can do an excellent job explaining it to you so that you can understand this within this 30-minute video. So go ahead, David.
Great, thanks, Devorah. I'm going to explain in simple terms what we're doing, and then we can unfold its potential complexity through the conversation. Essentially, what I've discovered is that when we talk about the body, mind, and spirit, as you just said, an integrated whole, we're really talking about a pulsating living organism. And what happens under stress or tension or traumatic events is that the pulsation of the organism gets reduced, meaning it starts to squeeze itself because it's its only physical way of actually creating a protective barrier against the threat. What I discovered is that that squeezing or reduction of pulsation occurs whether the threat is a psychological one, an emotional one, or a physical one. Doesn't matter to the human organism. It knows that whatever it's encountering is potentially dangerous or threatening, and so it squeezes itself, which is a simple explanation of how we have a stressful day and end up with a tight neck or tight shoulders, or we have trouble breathing a nice, deep, relaxing breath. All of those are the somatic indicators that the body has somehow squeezed itself, and at some point throughout the day, it felt threatened. Now, that's an autonomic response. We don't do it consciously. Most of the time, we don't even know it's happening. And that type of response comes from very primitive parts of the brain, mostly the brainstem and the limbic system. They're not coming from the cortex, which is our conscious brain. And so the brainstem and the limbic system, when they feel threatened, these primitive parts of the brain cause a neurophysiological response of protection. Now, it would make sense also that within that same system of the brainstem and limbic system, it would have a way to release that also would be unconscious and autonomic. And that's the piece that we've missed in medical science, is that the release mechanism from that unconscious contraction is actually the tremor or shaking mechanism that occurs in the human body that we often experience when we're under stress. If you were going to stand up in front of a big audience and you were going to give a speech and you were nervous about talking in front of people, you might find your legs are shaking or your hands are shaking or your voice might even quiver and shake. That's the autonomic nervous system trying to take this over-squeezed and over-contracted system and trying to reduce the contraction. And the way it does that is literally to shake itself. So when it begins to shake, the muscle actually goes from a tightly contracted place into a gently relaxed place. And it's all autonomic. The body both knows how to squeeze itself and it knows how to shake itself out of that squeezed state. What happened in sort of our medical history is that we interpreted that shaking mechanism as part of the pathology of the anxiety or the stress. So that now we say, oh, I'm so nervous I was shaking, give me something to calm me down. What we missed is the shaking is the calming us down. And so what happened is we interpreted the shaking as weak, vulnerable, insecure, and we put a negative context on it. And so then we try to stop it from happening. So when we start to shake, which is so automatic and it's the organism trying to restore its pulsation, we actually inhibit the shaking because we have a negative connotation to it. So in this exercise routine and this technique that I'm teaching, which is called tension and trauma releasing exercises, what we literally do is we take the individual through a series of simple exercises, and in the end, they're laying down on the floor, and they've activated this tremor mechanism. And what I discovered that it does is this shaking mechanism in the body, when you stimulate it artificially, it finds in the body the places that have contracted and have not released, meaning they haven't gone through their full cycle of contraction and relaxation. It finds those areas and it gets them stimulated to shake or tremor, and then it brings to completion the full response of the stress relaxation response. And just as the contraction is autonomic or automatic, and we're even unconscious, the tremor mechanism also is autonomic and automatic. You could read a book while it happens, you could watch TV, it doesn't matter because it's the natural neurophysiology actually finding places that are unresolved, those chronic tension patterns that we have all the time. Or when we always say, every time I'm under stress, it's my left shoulder that tightens. Well, that's an indicator there's a chronic pattern there. And this shaking mechanism actually travels through the organism, finds the pattern, and brings it to completion, and then it's gone for good.
And, you know, I'm going to mention that in some of your video clips, you have things like pictures. It doesn't have to be trauma. It can be repetitive motion. Some of the clients that I'm working with, I'll ask them for a short history of injuries and what have you, and then they'll be down tremoring, and all of a sudden I'm saying, well, what's kind of going on with your hips over here? And they'll say, oh, didn't I tell you I was born with dysplasia and had braces on? So all these old patterns that your muscles and your fascia have locked into place, a lot of people even forget about them. But
Oh,
it can be, I've seen people with a lot of finger movements, and I said, did you have a traumatic time playing the piano? It's all kinds of things that come up. So David, how did you kind of discover this whole technique? How
Okay.
did you figure this out?
I'm going to answer that in a second. I want to build on what you just said because it's so primary. There are so many innocent experiences that we have in life. And what I want to say, I identify trauma in a broad terminology of anything that inhibits the pulsation of the organism. And that could be falling off a ladder. That could be training yourself in a sports activity where you throw a ball and you overtrain the right side to an imbalance of the left side. It could be in braces as a child. It could have been any type of sort of innocent experience in life. Even, something as simple as falling down and hurting your knee. Well, that'll create a contraction through the whole side of the body. So you're right about that. It's not just about trauma, unless we expand the word trauma to understand it to mean anything that inhibit or shock the pulsation of the organism. And so I think your point is very well taken. So how did I discover this? It's really kind of quite simple, actually, and it's a wonderful lesson in life for all of us. I observed what all of us observe. Every fireman, policeman, EMT, soldier will tell you when they arrived on the scene, somebody was sitting there shaking. And of course, they interpreted it the way we've been trained to interpret it in our clinical practice is that somehow a breakdown of the system rather than the system actually trying to restore itself. I happened to be living in the Middle East. I was living in several countries where there was war and we were being bombed regularly. And after the bombing, many times or during the bombing, I would shake uncontrollably. And of course I said, well, that's my nerves and that's the nervous system response, etc. But everybody else would shake too. And I began to think, wow, isn't this interesting how the human body shakes like this all over the world? Because we were all from different cultures and countries. And then I began to realize that after we shook, we actually felt better rather than worse. So I asked a different question about the obvious. Everybody has seen it. I simply asked a different question. Does this have some potential positive value in the human body? And that's basically how it was born.
So, yeah, and I think when I was reading your book, you were talking about being in the Middle East and being with people from 6 different continents and really noticing the same behavior. So obviously none of us were taught this. It's a natural, innate instinct.
Right.
So let's go with that. Is this a natural, innate instinct? Do we shut it down? Do we allow our conscious, our ego to shut this down? What's the easiest way to connect with our natural?
Okay, the easiest way to understand this is that when crying is a perfect example. Up to about 2 years of age, we sort of cry openly. We fall, we hurt our knee, mommy yells at us, or daddy, disciplines us, and we cry because crying is simply the organism is overstimulated. It naturally pulsates the diaphragm because crying releases tension. We already know that. But then we start to grow up and we're trained how not to cry. See, so we're actually trained to override these autonomic systems in the body that actually are designed to ensure we continue to pulsate freely. So when you work with somebody who says, I haven't cried in 30 years, or I don't even know how to cry anymore, or when we hold back anger because it's not socially acceptable to express the anger any longer. So we hold it back all week long because our boss is mad and we're trying to keep things calm and quiet, but I'm mad at my boss, but I don't express that. So we actually learn how to override autonomic systems in the body, mostly as a social engagement behavior. And what I've discovered is that we override very important mechanisms, and this shaking mechanism is one of them. And it is, in fact, all over the world. Every human organism shakes or tremors. And so if that's the case, it must still be providing some type of service to the human organism, or else we would have evolved out of it, as an example. And since we haven't evolved beyond the tremor mechanism, which mammals have, you can see a dog shake in a thunderstorm. We have the phrase all the time. I was so nervous my knees were knocking. My teeth were chattering. We have the phrases that say, we see this and we know that humans do it all the time. I simply ask the question, what value does it have? And when I twisted the question around, then I discovered it has a tremendous value of bringing the organism out of this contracted tight state or dissociated state sometimes and gets it to start to pulsate again. And that's all that we're really doing is reinitiating a genetically encoded autonomic response in the human body.
Okay, so can you tell us about some of your experiences in other places of the world? Does this work in other countries?
Well, what's fascinating about this is that literally this mechanism is part of the human organism. So it's a human response. So when I use it, I can go below culture, below language, below sort of the limitations that psycho-emotional techniques might have. I'm actually just activating something that's genetically encoded in the human nervous system. And so when I work in other countries, like let's say we worked in Japan with tsunami survivors, we worked in China with earthquake survivors, I work with people who are first responders as an example, or you work with some type of cultural trauma, okay, poverty as an example. It consistently works the same way, and it has multiple results, not because it's some sort of wonderful technique for all purposes. Almost all of the secondary stressors that we experience in life, a lot of the gastrointestinal problems, the aches and pains, blood pressure problems, etc., the root cause is always stress. See, so this actually begins to resolve the root cause, which then allows a multiple number of other secondary problems within the organism to actually also come back to resolution. So I work with people who have chronic pain all the time, sciatica, headaches, people who have gastrointestinal problems, irritable bowel syndrome, all those things, high blood pressure. This works very, very quickly to actually bring the organism back into its balance again so that it can now work on these secondary manifestations of the primary problem, which was stress. And when I say stress, I mean literal physical contraction of the organism, which prevents it from, in a sense, functioning at its optimum health internally.
That's very interesting. So What I love about trauma releasing exercises, my background is as a psychotherapist, is that is totally based on science versus a lot of the woo-woo kind of modalities that I actually love and I think are very quick. But some people aren't open to these other things or spiritual practices. So can you explain some of the science behind this in a way that people can really understand it, please?
Yes. So we're going to talk about a number of different systems, and we can talk about the nervous system as an example. There's a communication system in the nerves, and it's called afferent neurons. Afferent neurons go from the extremities of the body, and they send signals to the brain. Okay, and that's so if you put your hand over a hot stove and you jerk it like that, it's the signal that's coming from the hand that's telling the brain to move the hand, okay? Well, when you feel that heat of the stove and the afferent neuron communication is sent up here, the brain responds with an efferent response, meaning it makes you move your hand away. So that afferent-efferent communication is part of the nervous system, and it happens outside of our consciousness. You don't think to move your hand, you simply feel the heat and you have an instinctual response to move it away. Well, this tremor mechanism is based on that communication system in this sense. When we cause the body to go through stressors, meaning through the exercise routine, in one of the exercise routines where you're sitting against the wall, the stressor in the quad muscles begins to cause a tremor mechanism to be evoked. And what that is afferent communication going from the muscles to the brain, and the brain responding, saying, this is a pretty stressful position. And so then we reduce the stress, and here's where the uniqueness of the trauma-releasing exercises comes from. I learned that if you reduce the stress, not only does the muscle continue to vibrate or tremor, but it actually begins to start moving through the organism. And so theories have taught, physical research has taught, if you increase the stress, the tremors will increase. And I discovered if you reduce the stress, the tremors increase. And not only increase, but they travel through the body. So now we have the nervous system working with us. So let's connect that nervous system. That's how we activate or stimulate the tremor mechanism, okay? That's activated. Now what does it do after that? Well, that mechanism is in what's called the brain stem. And the brain stem is a very primitive part of the brain, controls the heart rate, the blood pressure, our breathing, etc. So that brain stem has this tremor mechanism built into it. So now we have the body and the brain stem talking to each other. And as the brain stem starts to release the muscles in the body where the tension patterns are held, then the limbic system gets involved. And the limbic system is the emotional center of the brain. So if I'm releasing some tension pattern that's very old and I've completely forgotten about it, and it might be in my arm as an example, as the muscles start to tremor and that starts to release, I may have the memory of when I first contracted it, and I may have the emotion around it as well. So now we have the tremor mechanism is evoking neurologically the emotional history behind that, as well as the potential story behind it. And so now all three parts of the brain, the brainstem, limbic system, and cortex, are working with the muscle patterns in the body to bring a complete resolution of the physical tension that was created, the emotional stress that was activated at the time of that trauma or stressful event, and the potential cognition or memory of the event. All of that collectively, the brain, the three parts of the brain, as well as the nervous system connected to the extremities of the body, work as one operating machine to bring a full resolution to the traumatic or stressful event that's still stuck in the body and seeking completion. So that's how you have the physical, the psychological, and the emotional all achieving resolution simultaneously.
So does somebody have to understand all this to get the benefits?
You know, this is so funny. I'm going to talk about soldiers that I love dearly. They're wonderful, and I work with a lot of them. They don't understand any of this. They don't care about any of this. They just want a good night's sleep, basically.
That's right.
So it's wonderful. I teach this to soldiers. They don't want to do counseling. They don't want to tell their story. I say, we're just going to do exercises. And soldiers know exercises well. They're comfortable. But when they are laying on the floor and they are tremoring, they're able to talk about the experience that's going on in their body, because it's not, in a sense, as you mentioned earlier, it's not some vague energy. You can physiologically feel it happening in your structure. You can lift your head up and look at your legs. You can see that they're shaking and moving, so they can identify something that's going on in their body at the moment. Without understanding it, and they don't need to, it still brings resolution to the tight muscles. Sometimes they'll say, oh, that's from the airplane that I had to jump out of and I landed wrong, or that was carrying my rucksack for 2 weeks straight and it was heavy. So they can have memories evoked without even wanting to talk about it. And they say, oh, I know why it's shaking there. And so I know that the tremor mechanism's doing its job neurologically in them. So literally, and for many of us, we don't know traumas that we had even at 2 weeks after birth. Or, you know, our mother accidentally dropped us one day or something like that. We may not know any of those things, but that doesn't mean that the organism didn't register that as a threat in some way, and it contracted against it. So you don't need memory or story to heal with using this method.
So I know you've done some work in Africa. Does the trauma-releasing exercise, how has it affected extremely traumatized populations where really awful atrocities have happened? Can you speak to your work in Africa a little bit?
Yeah, it's quite fascinating to me that because the tremor mechanism is so organic to the human organism, it seems to not have much of a regard or an impediment to even healing some of the worst of traumas, abuses as an example, or rape, or violence, or poverty. All of those types of experiences, the tremor mechanism has no concern or regard for what caused it to contract. It's exactly the opposite. All it knows is this is the mechanism I need to start to repulsate back into life. So almost in an uninhibited way, it keeps trying to pulsate back to life. That's where some of the psycho-emotional stuff, if it's severe trauma as an example, we have to slow down the tremor mechanism because it's full steam ahead. It wants to heal and it has no care about what caused it to contract. It just says, great, I'm ready to release. But then if an emotion comes up that's an emotion from a severe abuse or a death or something like that, then we have to slow down and help the individual process that emotion because they're human as well. When we're activating the tremor mechanism, it has nothing to do, in a sense, with your psycho-emotional humanity. It's just a pulsating amoeba trying to restore itself back to a live pulsation. That's what it's designed to do. So now it becomes this little interplay between the organic you and the psycho-emotional or ego you, and I try to help those re-achieve harmony again.
So how do people get introduced to your work? I'm going to hold up, this is your older book, and I'm sorry I don't have a new copy. And you actually do have pictures of some of the exercises here. And here you are. Okay. So how would one get introduced to TRE? I think you have some videos on your website. Could you mention your website and talk about what people can find there, so how they can get introduced to this entire process? Because I personally love it, and I would like to tell you that it might look, I've had some pretty violent tremoring, and it might look uncomfortable, but it's actually very pleasurable. And you feel such a sense of euphoric release afterwards. I have had significant trauma in my life, and I will tell you, this is the ideal treatment for PTSD, what we know of today. So how do people find out about this? How do they get connected with TRE?
First of all, they can go to my website, which is traumaprevention.com. And that gives some of the explanation that we've been talking about here and a little bit more. It also has a listing of people all over the world. We're in about 35 countries who are trained to teach this. Because if some people have severe trauma, sometimes they're a little bit nervous to do something new by themselves, so it's better for them to seek out somebody that can take them through the process, simple enough. And if they can do it one time and they feel safe and comfortable and it's pleasurable, then they can go home and do it by themselves. They can also buy a book or a DVD. Anything that I sell has the exercise routine in it, so it's easy enough to do. I don't put the exercise routine on the internet because if somebody did it that was not prepared for it and they didn't understand what might happen to them, then that could create some really unfortunate experiences for people. So I prefer that I know they bought a book, they read everything about it, they looked at the DVD that explains everything for them, and then they use it. I'm trying to build in a safety mechanism for them.
Well,
so,
you know, yes. I thought, okay, this is perfect for me. I've had all this trauma. I don't have the funds to get involved in really lengthy psychotherapy. Even though I'm a psychotherapist, I was a single mom. I bought the book way back in 2005. I started trying to do the exercises in the book, and then I just said, oh my goodness, this is way too complicated. This is way too difficult. I'm going to stress out my body trying to do these exercises. So unfortunately, I think that sometimes you might need to really start with an actual practitioner. So what do you think about that? What's your take about that?
Well, I have exactly the same thing. When you're reading it in a book, it's a little bit more complicated. If you saw it on the video, it's easier because there's explanation on there. Okay, here's what you do. If it's too painful, don't do it, etc. So you take the stressor out of the whole thing. I really encourage people, one time if you can, even over a Skype session, because many TRE providers teach over Skype, just have somebody guide you through because they'll show you the easier way. When you're putting something in a book, you're really restricted to the limitations of words and pictures and explanation. Where somebody leads you through it, it's much more simplified. But the other issue behind it is that I like them to go at least one time, because they don't have to do it more than once with somebody, so you can really just pay for one session. Go one time to somebody to make sure that you don't have an adverse reaction, meaning if they're activating or accessing some severe traumas, they might have a flooding of emotions, and they may need somebody to be there just to hold their hand. Or they might actually have a dissociative experience, not because the tremor mechanism evokes that. It finds it that it's unresolved still, and so then they again might want somebody there to be able to work with them. But if you do it one time, and your experience is fine, and you feel healthy and safe, and it was great, and it releases the tension, then you can do it any time after that by yourself. So it's one of those things, it's a self-help routine, and I deliberately designed it that way. But I also have a certification process, because if you're going to guide somebody else through it, you have to responsibly understand what you might encounter, which is different than what you may have experienced personally.
Right. And I'm just going to mention, just because my background is psychotherapy, that if you do have a lot of emotional trauma associated with this, that maybe you even want to seek out a mental health expert. I started with somebody that was more into neurogenic yoga, and I found her approach a little too harsh or militaristic for me, and I ended up working with somebody else in the end. So this is an empowerment skill. Anybody can do it. You can modify the exercises. If you're uncomfortable with any of them, just modify them. You don't have to take yourself to extreme pain. You don't want to take yourself into extreme pain. So are there any other case examples? Is the military maybe looking at this? What else do you want to say about this?
Yeah, well, where we're at right now in terms of our introduction into the medical field is we have several research projects already presented to the military. Thousands of military have already used it and found it very, very helpful. But what I really like to say is what you had said, it's for the general daily life. It is an autonomic mechanism that we are still genetically encoded with. And what it does is it moves the body in the direction of better health. So in one sense, it's for every human being on the planet, because it would be like saying breathing is only for some human beings. This is a tremor mechanism. Crying is for every human being. Tremoring is for every human being. It's easy to activate, and the only thing it does is try to restore pulsation in any way that it's been inhibited by the natural stressors and tensions of life. And so in that sense, I want to say this is for everybody. It's available for everybody. You said everybody can do this, and it's true. Everybody should restore the mechanism and then start using it, because it will only bring you towards better health.
And you know, some of your most interesting videos that I've seen in your actual classroom are the fascia unwinding. So can you try to explain this a little bit? Because I think many people, athletes and people that are performing repetitive motions, butchers or, you know, mechanics or carpenters, right, might really be able to benefit from that explanation.
Yeah, okay, so let's explain just briefly and quickly what fascia is. So you have different muscle groups. So we have muscles here in the arm as an example, and those are different muscle groups. But around those muscle groups is like a plastic bag. And that plastic bag kind of holds those muscle groups into form. So that if I need to reach out to grab a glass of water, the fascia helps hold the form so the muscles can perform their job. And there are many fascia patterns all over the body, and they're around individual muscles and groups of muscles, etc. So think of fascia as having patterns all throughout the body. It's a communication system in the body, and it works in conjunction with the muscle groups and patterns of the body. What happens when you tremor? When the shaking mechanism activates, it will often just begin to activate in one muscle or a muscle group. So you might see the whole hand moving like this, which is telling me there are multiple muscles that have stimulated the tremor mechanism. But then you may see the hand start to move in a way that it's now connecting multiple muscle groups, not just in the forearm, but it's coming down the arm, going into the shoulder, and it could actually go clear across the shoulder, and the other arm will start moving. That's the indicator that the fascia pattern that's connecting all of the muscle groups in the arms and shoulders to ensure that those move in harmony with each other, they have started to release, and now they're restoring themselves back to flexibility and mobility. So when I see whole patterns that can go literally from the foot to the neck, and some of those videos are on YouTube, actually, on my YouTube site, you can see the difference between a fascia pattern, which is a pattern of many muscle groups working together to restore the harmony and the symmetry in the body, or just a simple muscle group that's doing it. Now, the value of this is, mostly for sports people, actually, I've found that they overtrain one side of the body, or either the top or the bottom or left or right sides, and so then they stretch the fascia or the plastic casing on one side more than the other side. And eventually that creates an imbalance in the structure, and that's why many sports people have injuries throughout their sports career, because they're living in an imbalanced structure. And I've worked with many sports people and discovered this not only restores the symmetry of the body, but as a result of that, improves their sport capacity.
Yeah, secondary gains.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is it's usually a unilateral movement on one side or one extremity. So it definitely looks different. And to get physical therapy to get these results might take a really long time, where this is your innate ability to heal yourself.
Exactly right. And one of the limitations that we're talking about, and I love all these different modalities, myofascial releases, physical therapy, chiropractic, etc. They're all good. I have nothing wrong with them. But the thing about this tremor mechanism, which is different, is it's already working with the inside of the structure. So it already knows where the limitation of the myofascial pattern is, or it knows what muscle needs to release next. So it has its own innate pattern that it can follow, which we may not consciously know, because plenty of times I've released somebody's left hip, and that's when the right shoulder was able to release. It was a crossover fascia pattern that they kept saying, my right shoulder is the problem. Well, that's where the pain was presenting itself, but the problem was in the left hip, and until that could release, the right shoulder could never release itself. And so in that sense, the tremor mechanism gives us insight to the internal patterns of the body, rather than me having to just look externally, wondering what's going on and how do we resolve it.
And so even though you think that trauma releasing exercise, that you don't really know about any specific traumas, we're also talking about tension. We're talking about a sleep disorder. There are so many things. When I heard about your work, David, I just fell in love with it, and I've followed you, and I was able to go to some classes even though they're around the country. And I just really honor and appreciate this technique and what you've brought to the world. So thank you, David. Really.
Thanks. That's really kind of you to say that. I'm really happy to hear that. And I'm very happy to be able to try to spread this, which I'm trying to do around the world. Really just to get people to realize, oh my gosh, inside of us is a mechanism that's been dormant, and we still have it, and we can use it to come back to health. That's an exciting sort of experience.
And another exciting thing, this is pure science. You don't have to believe in any kind of spirituality. You don't have to go to any alternative practitioners. This is all based on pure science. And
this whole thing is neurophysiology. That's it. It doesn't matter what belief system you have, because I work with all religions and belief systems around the world, and I still say, okay, you're a pulsating amoeba. Let's figure out how to get you to pulsate. How you interpret that in terms of your spirituality or religion is your issue, and I don't care about it. But it's not inhibiting the pulsation mechanism.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, too. I appreciate this.
Okay, goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.